we've sort of arrived at this conclusion somehow. Spirituality has become so watered down that we think enlightenment is the be-all and the end-all of spiritual practice. It's the finish line. It's not. There are actually things that come after that. What we think of as enlightenment is the first step in a process. In Magick, what they call in the East enlightenment, we call solar consciousness, because, the sun represents Christ being, the Son of God, all this sort of thing. Solar consciousness means that you are completely and absolutely in the present moment, just like whenever you achieve enlightenment. After you develop solar consciousness, the next step in this process is developing what we call the solar body, which is very similar to in Dzogchen. People think Dzogchen is Buddhism. It actually predates the birth of the Buddha by something like 6,000 years. What happened is the native tradition of Bon in Tibet was a magic practice. Well, whenever Buddhism started moving into Tibet, these two things integrated, combined to form Tibetan Buddhism, which is why Tibetan Buddhism looks so radically different from like Zen, and it looks different from Vietnamese Buddhism, and it looks different from Korean Buddhism. That's because Tibetan Buddhism still has a incredibly strong magical presence there.
Yeah.
Well, in Dzogchen, the end result of their practice, what they're aiming for, is what they call building the rainbow body. Now, if you've ever looked up like monks, lamas that have completed this process, you'll see after a period of about 7 days after they die, they don't move the body. Other lamas, other monks come in and they continue the practices around the body, but for 7 days, the body will start to shrink until after about a week-long period, you end up with something that looks almost like a small mummified form that they say there's no putrefaction, there's no smell of decay, any of this sort of stuff. They then put that little mummy-looking thing on a shrine, and it stays there as like a holy relic. In Magick, we're aiming for the same process. They say that if you reach the very, very end of what you're supposed to be doing here, the only thing that will be left within 7 days after your death is hair, fingernails, and toenails. The reason those things are left is because they're not connected to your nervous system. Your nervous system is the key to a lot of these practices. That's why whenever they go to, the tomb after they crucify Christ, they say there's no body there. Well, that's because he was doing these practices. Wow. There wouldn't be a body there. Anytime you see in the Bible where it's talking about someone ascending to heaven, body and soul, that's what they're talking. Now, there aren't many. Like I said, this is not a practice that everyone masters. The only people in the Bible that talks about doing it were Christ, Elijah, Enoch, and in some accounts, Mary Magdalene. So it's not like a thing that is like really easy to do. But part of this process, when you're building what we call the solar body, you are building a vehicle to allow your consciousness to not disintegrate at the point of what we call the second death. The first death is when the physical body dies. The second death is whenever your astral or etheric body begins to unravel. That's whenever your consciousness goes through this sort of cosmic washing machine. Every aspect of personality is washed out of it. You're left with a kernel of pure energy, which is then recycled into something else. If you develop the solar body, that doesn't happen. You put your consciousness into the solar body at the moment of death, you then become something similar to what in Eastern traditions they would call a bodhisattva. Not entirely, not exactly the same, but your consciousness is then completely unbroken for eternity. You will never again go through the process of being born and not remembering who or what you are or anything else. From that point on, you can come into the physical realm when, where, and how you choose, if you choose to do so. The point is to help other people complete this process. Beethoven said that the point of being alive, the point of being human, is to approach divinity as closely as you possibly can and then disseminate those rays out to mankind. That's what we're doing with Magick also. First, you want to develop the solar consciousness or go through the process of enlightenment. Then you build the solar body. Astral projection is a huge part of that process. If you can project your consciousness into other realms, into other objects, then you can project it into this solar body. After you develop the solar body, you are then free to basically do whatever the hell you want to do. You can help other people accomplish the process. You can form your own universe. Whatever the hell it is you're wanting to do, that's the end end of the solar body.
Wow. This is so cool, man. I'm so happy to be chatting with you. Because it's so nice. Because what you're saying is the reason to do this is to help. It's not like, and this is what I love, is because like it's not like these beings. Maybe bodhisattva is the right word for it. I don't know, but
in Magick they usually call, and this is another word that sounds horrible, but they call them secret chiefs.
Secret chiefs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is when we were talking earlier. You were saying that there is this possibility that you can actually make contact with someone who isn't in a body.
Exactly.
Who can start teaching you.
Exactly.
Potentially.
Exactly.
Regardless of where you may be.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the teachings in one of the teachers in Tibetan Buddhism. I think his name was Tilopa. This is how he learned, was not from an embodied person, but from, I think the Avalokiteshvara Buddha like came to him directly, and he got the transmission.
Yes.
So the spark can not just only be passed from human to human, but it can also be passed from...
I'll tell you two things. One is that's partially, you ask who trained me, how did I learn all this? That's partially what started to happen to me after a certain point. When I got to where I was doing magic for like 5 hours a day, I experienced the disintegration of ego, of what I thought I was. The only way I can articulate it is I experienced myself as something like someone throwing a handful of sand into a tornado. Like I just come apart. It was terrifying. You know, when we think of going through this process that we call enlightenment, we think it's like all bliss and flowers. It's not. You die. Everything you think you are comes apart. I was absolutely terrified. I was convinced I was going to die for a short period of time. What eventually happened was I realized, well, if I'm disintegrating, then who is it that's watching the disintegration process? I can't be disintegrating if I'm watching the disintegration. Therefore, I'm not what I thought I was. I am this observer that's sort of in the background of what I thought I was. Once I realized that, once that clicked into place, suddenly everything was okay. Then, this is where you start to sound crazy to people sometimes. It's exactly like what you described with the guy who was, saying he received these teachings from Avalokiteshvara. I started to download things that, for me, these things pass through cultural lenses. That's what I mean about the things that are in our psyche. For me, it's, the Western stuff. What I started to perceive, the way that I recognized it, was not as an Eastern deity, but as... It's hard to say this because it sounds so crazy, but as the deity that in ancient Mesopotamia they called Enlil, E-N-L-I-L. I had never heard this name before, didn't know anything about it whatsoever. Whenever the process ended, the disintegration process, it was like suddenly, you're in this storm, this horrible fucking storm that you don't know if you're going to survive. And suddenly it stops and there's peace. And it's like the sunrise after you've gone through a week-long hurricane. Wow. And there's just this calm. And I saw, when I say saw, I don't mean with my physical eyes. You perceive it somewhere internally. I saw spelled out, almost like a gentle wind moving across the sky, the letters E-N-L-I-L.